Can human pride, no matter how monumental, truly defy the relentless judgment of nature? What happens when a nation, cornered by desperation, pours its last hopes and deepest fears into a single, magnificent creation, only for it to vanish in the cold embrace of the sea? It was November 29, 1944. South of the Japanese homeland, the vast, inky ocean lay in a deceptive, almost sinister calm, too still, perhaps, for the colossal secret it cradled. Beneath that black, undisturbed surface, a faint, ghostly light flickered from within the largest ship the Empire of Japan had ever dared to conceive. 70,000 tons of intricately armored steel, a behemoth forged from a nation's indomitable will and its profound despair, sliced through the darkness like a moving mountain. This wasn't merely a vessel. It was a defiant statement, a rolling fortress carrying the fervent pride of a people who steadfastly refused to concede defeat. The aircraft carrier Shinano, a floating symbol of a shattered dream, had been at sea for a mere 18 hours. She was a leviathan, easily dwarfing any skyscraper laid on its side, her expansive decks wide enough to encompass an entire city block. Every meticulously placed weld, every rivet hammered into her formidable hull, every precious drop of oil flowing through her powerful engines, had been imbued with a single unshakable conviction: she was unsinkable. Yet, in that profound silence, an unseen hunter stalked her, a shadow moving silently beneath the waves. At precisely 3:17 a.m., a subtle, unsettling rumble vibrated through the colossal hull, a tremor that seemed to foreshadow the catastrophe. Then, with terrifying force, came four gut-wrenching, deep explosions that didn't just shake the ship, but seemed to violently convulse the very ocean itself. On board, chaos erupted. The lights instantly dimmed, struggling against the sudden power surge. Pipes burst, unleashing scalding steam into the dark corridors. The immense vessel, once a picture of serene power, began its agonizing tilt, listing dangerously to starboard. Officers, their faces etched with disbelief and growing panic, screamed urgent orders into the deepening pandemonium. Sailors, their bare feet slapping through quickly rising, knee-deep seawater, stumbled and ran. And somewhere deep within the ship's labyrinthine lower decks, a single, crucial steel door, never fully tested, stubbornly refused to seal. The unforgiving ocean had found its way in quietly, relentlessly, like a thief in the night. No one on board, not yet, truly grasped the magnitude of what had just happened. They were oblivious to the fact that, far beneath their feet, 6 American torpedoes had been launched with deadly precision by an unseen submarine. They had never even registered the presence of the USS Archerfish. They couldn't possibly know that within a mere 7 agonizing hours, the most magnificent carrier Japan had ever constructed would tragically transform into its most profound and devastating loss. What unfolded that night, amidst the dark, churning waters, was more than just a sinking. It was a rewrite of the very annals of naval history. Shinano, in her deepest essence, was never truly conceived for the brutal realities of battle. Her true purpose was far more profound. She was a symbol, a grand, defiant gesture. She existed to proclaim to the world that Japan, even in its darkest hour, could still birth something that boldly defied logic, that sheer size and impenetrable armor could somehow outlast the encroaching shadow of defeat. But the ocean, ancient and indifferent, held no respect for human pride or desperate hopes. It simply waited, patient and omnipotent. And when the first, tiny cracks of vulnerability appeared, it moved in with a quiet, relentless certainty, much like time itself, slowly but surely reclaiming steel, human ambition, and lives. Every man serving aboard that colossal vessel that fateful night held an unshakable belief that they were sailing upon an indestructible fortress, a steel bastion against all odds. Every single man would soon learn, with terrifying finality, that belief, however fervent, does not float, it inevitably sinks. The once reassuring roar of powerful machinery slowly faded into the agonizing groans of twisting, tortured metal. The familiar, sterile smell of fresh paint and lubricating oil mingled sickeningly with the briny, invading seawater. And above the escalating chaos, the ship's massive siren wailed one last mournful cry, a ghost of a warning, before it too died out, plunging the scene into a desperate silence, broken only by the sounds of the ship's slow demise. Somewhere in the suffocating darkness of the dying ship, A young sailor, his voice barely a whisper, murmured, "This can't be happening." Not to Shinano. They called her unsinkable. The ocean, in its silent, brutal efficiency, called her bluff. Do you believe that the immense weight of human pride can truly imbue something with invincible power? Comment on, if you are convinced that the tragic fate of the Shinano began to unfold long before that fateful night. A slow burning consequence of human misjudgment, or hit like, if you believe in inescapable fate, rather than human error, irrevocably decided her end. To fully comprehend the desperate circumstances that brought Shinano into being, we must first confront the devastating losses Japan had already endured. A mere 2 years earlier, in the sweltering heat of June 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy suffered a defeat so utterly crushing, so profoundly humiliating, that it shattered the carefully constructed illusion of invincibility painstakingly built since the audacious attack on Pearl Harbor. The cataclysmic Battle of Midway annihilated 4 of Japan's most vital frontline aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu, all obliterated in a single brutal day. Hundreds of highly trained and irreplaceable pilots were lost, and with them, the very heart and soul of Japan's once formidable naval air power. It was a wound so deep, so festering, that even the rigid censorship of Tokyo could not entirely conceal its horrifying reality from the highest echelons of the military elite. Within the hushed, somber halls of the naval staff, a chilling, unspoken question hung heavy in the air, echoing the collective dread. Could the empire ever hope to regain its precarious balance on the vast, unforgiving expanse of the sea? From that unsettling, agonizing silence, a desperate answer eventually emerged, bigger, thicker, stronger. The brilliant, yet beleaguered, engineers at the Yokosuka shipyards received an extraordinary, almost impossible directive: to transform the colossal hull of an unfinished Yamato-class battleship into something the world had simply never witnessed before. A supercarrier, designed not just to float, but to withstand every single blow the surging American might could hurl against it. Her name would be Shinano, a sacred word drawn from the ancient heartland of Japan, symbolizing the enduring, unyielding spirit of the nation's towering mountains. The message, broadcast silently but powerfully to the world, was undeniably clear. Japan would construct not merely a ship, but an unequivocal, thundering statement of its unbreakable will. Inside the bustling yet secretly pressured shipyards, the order bordered on the brink of madness. The Shinano's displacement would eventually soar to an astronomical 70,000 tons, a staggering figure that was twice the size of any American carrier then in service. Her armor belt, a formidable shield against the sea's fury, measured a colossal 70 inches thick, and her vast flight deck, crafted from hardened steel rather than conventional wood, was meticulously engineered to shrug off direct bomb hits. She was designed to carry well over 100 aircraft, store an immense 4,000 tons of precious fuel, and serve as a vital, floating repair base for other damaged carriers. Her proud designers, perhaps a touch too boastful, claimed she possessed the ability to survive a dozen torpedo hits and still valiantly limp back to port. Yet, beneath these audacious claims, lay a far more poignant and deeper truth. Shinano was not born from a wellspring of confidence, but rather from the icy grip of profound fear. The Imperial Navy knew, with a sinking feeling, that its dwindling shipyards could no longer hope to match the relentless industrial tempo of America. While burgeoning U.S. factories were launching new, formidable carriers every few weeks, Japan, with its dwindling resources, could barely manage to complete a single one. The Shinano, therefore, was a desperate act of defiance, a fervent, last-ditch attempt to prove that exquisite craftsmanship and unwavering loyalty could still stand firm against the relentless tide of mass production, that precision welding and the devotion of its workers could somehow outlast an endless flow of American steel. In the cavernous workshops, welders toiled tirelessly under severe blackout conditions, their brilliant sparks flashing like fleeting fireflies against the cold, unyielding plates of armor. Some had already buried brothers lost at Midway. Others whispered silent prayers as their hammers struck rivets, each resounding clang carrying the weight of their nation's fate. They believed, with every fiber of their being, that this ship, this magnificent creation, held the power to restore their nation's shattered dignity. Every clang of steel against steel carried both the fervent flame of faith and the crushing burden of exhaustion. A shipyard worker years later vividly recalled, "We were not just building metal, we were building hope. But hope, we learned, has a terrible weight." By late 1944, the desperate situation for Japan was rapidly collapsing around them. American B-29 bombers were already raining destruction upon the home islands. Critical fuel supplies were running dangerously low. Pilots, once meticulously trained over many months, were now being rushed through their paces in mere weeks, barely ready for the brutal skies. And still, the unyielding Admiralty insisted, with an almost delusional fervor, that Shinano must sail, unfinished if absolutely necessary, because to delay her maiden voyage was to implicitly admit a fatal weakness. In the hushed, tension-filled meeting room of the Naval Ministry, one admiral is said to have declared, with chilling certainty, "Let her be seen by the people. They must know that the Empire still breathes." That single, audacious sentence, uttered in a moment of desperate pride, sealed her tragic fate. By November 1944, the immense hull of the Shinano stood gleaming in dry dock, her unpainted steel surfaces shimmering under dim, wary floodlights. Her vast interior, still raw and incomplete, smelled sharply of unworked steel and fresh primer paint. She had never, not once, completed her vital watertight testing. Her complex communication lines were still a jumble of temporary cables, and her crucial pumps had never undergone full calibration. But the symbol, the desperate beacon of hope, simply had to move. Orders were swiftly issued. She would depart immediately for Kerr Naval Base, where her fitting out would be hastily completed. When the final inspection report, stark and ominous, warned that the bulkheads remained dangerously incomplete, and the newly installed watertight doors might not withstand the immense pressure of the sea, the commanding officer in charge was dismissively told, "She is armored. She is Shinano. She will not need them." The overwhelming arrogance was not inherent in her steel, but tragically, in the men who harbored the dangerous belief that steel, however mighty, could somehow replace fundamental caution. That night, amidst the persistent hum of welders furiously finishing last-minute tasks, a small, somber group of engineers stood on the dockside, their gazes fixed on the giant hull glistening under the stark lights. One of them, his voice barely audible, whispered, "We built her too fast." Another, his reply heavy with despair, responded, "No, we built her too late." In that chilling moment, Japan's greatest, most ambitious ship was already doomed, not by the enemy's might, nor by the fickle hand of the sea, but by the deadly illusion that pride alone could ever substitute for true readiness. Do you believe that human pride blinds us more thoroughly than any external enemy ever could? Comment on, if you think Japan's relentless race for fleeting symbols, rather than sound strategy, irrevocably sealed Shinano's tragic fate, or hit like, if you believe she represented a necessary, defiant last stand for a proud nation cornered by the unforgiving currents of history. November 28, 1944. Yokosuka Naval Base lay shrouded in a suffocating blackout, not a single defiant light piercing the impenetrable gloom on the horizon. Only the slow, rhythmic pulse of welding arcs flickered erratically against cold steel, and the faint, ghostly hiss of acetylene torches echoed eerily through the cold night air. The order, stark and unyielding, had arrived from Tokyo that very morning. Shinano must sail tonight. Every officer on the base understood, with a tightening knot of dread, the desperate urgency of that command. The base had already been meticulously photographed by American reconnaissance planes, and intelligence reports whispered fears that an impending bombing raid could obliterate the precious ship before she ever had a chance to leave the harbor. The ship was profoundly incomplete, a vast construction site afloat, but to delay was no longer an option. At precisely 600 p.m., the largest warship Japan had ever dared to build began her hesitant, almost reluctant movement. Her immense engines rumbled to life with a low, throbbing vibration, sending concentric ripples of unease across the still harbor water. Workers on the dock, their tools momentarily forgotten, stopped their toil to watch. Many didn't speak. They simply stood in profound silence, their faces dimly illuminated by the fleeting red glow of their cigarettes, as the immense 872-foot hull of the Shinano slipped silently past them, a moving city of shadows fading into the night. Her fresh paint still glistened, her vast deck still carried the potent, raw scent of oil and primer. Inside, endless corridors revealed half-finished, bare metal walls, exposed wiring snaking along the bulkheads, and temporary lighting strung haphazardly along ceilings, creating the unsettling impression of a construction site inexplicably adrift at sea. Captain Toshio Abe stood on the bridge, his cap pulled low against the biting cold wind, his face a mask of solemn determination. A seasoned veteran who had witnessed the brutal sinking of the carrier Shokaku, he knew intimately the devastating cost of complacency. He had seen magnificent carriers explode and sink under relentless American bombs. Yet, even he felt the immense, almost crushing, weight of the symbol beneath his boots. "She is strong," one officer ventured, a hopeful note in his voice. Abe simply nodded, though the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes betrayed his true feelings. He knew the bitter truth's strength on paper meant absolutely nothing in the brutal, unforgiving crucible of the Pacific War. Behind Shinano, 3 destroyers, Isakes, Hamakes and Yukikes, trailed faithfully, all experienced escort vessels. Yet none of them were privy to the deeply guarded details of their monumental passenger. Orders from Naval Command had shrouded the entire operation in absolute secrecy. To their crews, it was simply designated as a special transport mission. Nothing more. In the ship's radio room, communication lines crackled with persistent static. No messages were to be sent, radio silence was absolute, a chilling testament to the mission's clandestine nature. The small convoy crept out into the vast, open sea under a moon partially veiled by scudding clouds. Inside the behemoth carrier, the mood was distinctly uneasy, a palpable tension in the air. Many of the crew were not seasoned sailors at all. Roughly 1/3 of the personnel were trained navalmen, while the remaining majority consisted of shipyard workers, engineers, and mechanics, still frantically installing equipment even as the ship moved through the water. Some slept, exhausted, beside stacks of crates filled with tools. Others stood nervously near unsealed hatches, listening with a growing sense of dread to the groaning creaks of the hull as it flexed with each gentle wave. The watertight doors, freshly fitted but untested, had never undergone pressure trials. The vital pumps had not completed their full operational tests. Bulkheads remained dangerously unfinished, their steel edges raw and dangerously sharp. It was a bizarre, unsettling voyage, half warship, half rapidly deteriorating construction site. Yet, on the surface, a facade of confidence was maintained. Japan's propaganda-filled newspapers had spoken, with inflated rhetoric, of a new, mighty weapon that would unequivocally turn the tide of the war. Officers whispered in low, hopeful voices about what would transpire once Shinano finally joined the fleet at Kure. How she would carry vital aircraft and spare parts, how she would become the unyielding heart of a new, formidable task force. But no one, not a single soul, dared to voice aloud what everyone knew in their deepest fears: fuel shortages and catastrophic air losses had already crippled Japan's once proud navy. Shinano was not sailing into glorious victory. She was sailing with a terrible, slow inevitability into a war already irretrievably lost. As the familiar coastline slowly faded behind them, the vast sea ahead transformed into an endless, inky blackness. The wind shifted, carrying the chilling, metallic scent of rain and diesel fuel. Abe, ever cautious, ordered a zigzag course at 20 knots, a standard maneuver to evade lurking submarines. The radar operators scanned the desolate horizon, but the equipment, brand new and utterly untested, flickered with maddening interference. The escorting destroyers reported no contacts, no shadows in the deep. The bridge crew exhaled in a collective, momentary relief. They foolishly believed the waters near their homeland were safe. They were tragically wrong. Beneath the same ominous, dark sea, 20 miles to the southeast, another vessel moved with an almost ethereal silence. The USS Archerfish, an American submarine commanded by the determined Joseph Enright, was relentlessly patrolling the crucial approaches south of Tokyo Bay. Enright had been on station for days, enduring a frustrating lack of any contact substantial enough to warrant an attack. He had been passed over for promotion once before, accused, unjustly he felt, of excessive caution. Tonight, in this lonely stretch of ocean, he desperately needed redemption. At 8:00 p.m., his radar operators picked up a faint, tantalizing blip large, fast, and steadily moving southwest. Enright frowned, his brow furrowed in concentration. "That's no convoy," he muttered to himself, his mind racing. "Too big. Too quick." He immediately ordered the submarine to periscope depth. Through the misty moonlight, a colossal shadow materialized, massive and utterly unlike anything he had ever encountered. Even through the distorted lens of his periscope, the silhouette stretched ominously across the horizon. He couldn't definitively identify what it was, only that it dwarfed anything afloat in the Pacific. "Captain, should we signal headquarters?" his cautious officer inquired. Enright hesitated, a weighty decision hanging in the balance. The strict radio silence imposed by command meant no guidance would arrive in time. The monumental decision was his alone to make. "No," he said finally, his voice firm. "We'll shadow her." And so began an epic, 6-hour pursuit across the silent, unforgiving waters. The archerfish, a predator in the dark, mirrored every turn of the colossal target, maintaining her distance, just beyond visual range. In the control room, despite the chilling cold of the deep, sweat clung to the men's faces. They whispered anxiously as they meticulously watched the stopwatch, tracking each agonizing maneuver. Every 30 minutes, Enright cautiously raised the periscope for a swift, fleeting look. The target loomed ever larger ahead, a dark, silent mountain gliding inexorably across the horizon. By 3:00 a.m., the Shinano executed a slow, sweeping turn to starboard, a maneuver that fatefully exposed her vulnerable broadside. Enright recognized the opportunity instantly, a hunter's instinct taking over. "Standby tubes 1 through 6, he ordered, his voice cutting through the tension. The submarine's bow swung precisely into firing position. The crew waited, utterly motionless, their breaths held. The tension in the cramped control room was so thick that even the faint hum of machinery seemed to fade into nothingness. Fire! 6 deadly torpedoes streaked away into the vast, dark night. 45 seconds later, 4 deafening detonations thundered through the deep, shaking the very foundations of the sea. The submarine's hull trembled violently from the shockwave. Inside Shinano, the reverberating explosions echoed like the final, agonizing heartbeat of a dying giant. Then, the sea returned to its chilling silence. Up on the bridge, Captain Abe gripped the railing, his knuckles white, as blaring alarms shrieked from below decks. He didn't yet know what unseen force had struck them, only that his magnificent ship was listing severely, and the vital pumps were ominously unresponsive. He shouted desperate orders: "Damage control! Seal compartments! Maintain course for the coast!" But every command, every desperate plea, came seconds too late. Seawater was already spreading relentlessly through the unfinished corridors, transforming national pride into sheer, unadulterated panic. The ocean, in its silent, brutal judgment, had finally answered Japan's greatest boast with an unforgiving, deafening silence. Do you think Shinano's ultimate doom was unequivocally sealed the moment she left port? Incomplete and vulnerable. Comment on, if you believe that rampant pride inexorably blinded them to the impending disaster, or hit like. If you believe that no ship, no matter how mighty, could have possibly survived the relentless forces unleashed that terrifying night. The vast, menacing expanse of ocean between the silent hunter and its unsuspecting prey was a mere few hundred feet of churning, black water. Yet, in that moment of profound darkness, neither side truly grasped the other's true colossal shape. At precisely 3:17 a.m., that fragile, terrifying silence was utterly shattered. 4 thunderous explosions tore through the deep with a violence that seemed almost unnatural, a primal scream from the depths. On board the Archerfish, the dim lights flickered wildly as the immense shockwave rolled across the submarine's resilient hull. Enright, his face grim, steadied himself against the control panel, his ears straining, counting 1, 2, 3, 4. The sounds were deep, bone-rattling heavy, and chillingly final. Then, a profound silence once more. No retaliatory depth charges, no frantic counterattack, only the dull, distant vibration of what sounded like secondary detonations somewhere far above. In the dim, eerie red light of the control room, the sonar operator slowly turned toward Enright, his face pale. Direct hits, Captain, he whispered, his voice laced with awe. Enright didn't immediately respond. He simply stared, mesmerized at the clock, meticulously marking each agonizing passing second, waiting for the indifferent ocean to reveal the full extent of what he had unleashed. He had fired 6 torpedoes, 4, he knew, had struck something unbelievably colossal. But what precisely had he hit? A formidable carrier, a battleship, or perhaps an empty transport convoy? The silhouette he had glimpsed had been unlike anything he had ever seen, a ghost ship of unparalleled scale. He couldn't possibly have known that he had just struck the largest warship ever constructed, a titan of the seas. 200 feet above them, the colossal Shinano trembled violently, like a mortally wounded animal in its final death throes. 4 torpedoes had struck her starboard side in quick succession, each punching devastating holes deep below the armored belt, precisely where her meticulously designed protection was at its weakest. The cataclysmic explosions instantly flooded 3 vital boiler rooms and several critical storage compartments. Steel bulkheads buckled and groaned under the immense, unnatural stress. Lights flickered out across vast sections of the ship. In the lower decks, pipes burst, unleashing scalding, high-pressure steam that rapidly filled the suffocating corridors. Sailors, their faces etched with panic, scrambled desperately to their posts, slipping and falling in a sickening mixture of water and heavy oil. Orders, shouted with increasing desperation, echoed through the swirling chaos. But without a functioning communication system, many critical compartments never received them. Captain Abe stood stoically on the bridge, his jaw set in a rigid line of grim determination. "Damage control," he barked, his voice straining to be heard above the din. "Seal the starboard compartments. Maintain course to the coast." His officers rushed to obey, but already, the ship's ominous list had grown to a perilous 5 degrees. The chief engineer, his face streaked with grease and fear, reported widespread flooding in multiple areas, pumps ominously unresponsive, and electric circuits failing one after another. Abe frowned, a deep line etched between his brows, but stubbornly refused to slow down. He clung to the desperate belief that Shinano's sheer, massive bulk could absorb the punishment, that her sheer size would somehow save them. "Full speed ahead!" he roared. We reached shallow water before dawn. It was a fatal, irreversible mistake. The immense speed, rather than aiding them, forced seawater deeper and faster into the damaged hull. The relentless pressure spread the catastrophic flooding from one compartment to the next, where unfinished welds and unsealed joints, the silent betrayals of a hurried construction, simply gave way. Engineers worked with frantic, desperate energy, using makeshift tools, wooden planks, mattresses, even wrenches jammed into leaking pipes, in a futile attempt to stem the tide. The ship was bleeding from within, a slow, agonizing hemorrhage, but the crew, still clinging to hope, didn't yet realize how rapidly the mortal wound was spreading. On board the Archerfish, Enright ordered the submarine to dive deeper, to 350 feet, for silent running. The men waited with bated breath for the inevitable retaliation. They expected a barrage of depth charges, the chilling ping of sonar, the ominous thud of destroyers dropping explosives. But none came. The hydrophone operator, his eyes wide, shook his head slowly. "No screws, Captain. No propeller noise. They're not chasing us." Enright exhaled slowly, a long, wary breath. "They don't know where we are." He didn't know it then, but he had just executed one of the most perfectly devastating submarine attacks in naval history. 6 torpedoes fired, 4 confirmed hits, 0 counter-fire. The ocean above him remained still, almost eerily peaceful, while somewhere in that profound darkness, 70,000 tons of steel were dying by inches, a titanic struggle playing out unseen. Back aboard Shinano, the minutes stretched into an eternity, each second dragging with unbearable weight. Officers sprinted through the labyrinthine corridors, shouting increasingly desperate orders, but half their telephones were dead, and the voice tubes were choked with invading water. Damage control teams struggled frantically to coordinate their efforts, but every crucial decision took precious, life-saving minutes to reach the besieged bridge. By 400 a.m., the ship's ominous list had worsened significantly, reaching a perilous engrease. The vital pumps, their motors shorted by the spreading flooding, were now running manually, their crewmen cranking them by hand, sweat mingling with the cold, invading salt water. They could hear the terrifying groaning of the bulkheads below, a deep, metallic moan that vibrated unnervingly through their very boots, a sound of profound structural agony. Captain Abe, his face grim, still refused to panic. "We will hold," he declared, clinging to a fading hope. Shinano was built for this. He placed his unwavering trust in the steel beneath his feet, utterly unaware that the ship's immense armor was designed to repel bombs from above, not the insidious, crushing force of underwater explosions. The true damage lay deep below her protection, in the untested, vulnerable lower compartments. There, seawater crept forward with a relentless, terrifying inevitability, filling the stern, reaching the critical ammunition stores, washing over electrical junctions that sparked and hissed ominously. At 4:30 a.m., one of the escort destroyers, the Isakays, cautiously approached, signaling by light. "Are you hit?" the signalman asked. The Shinano's desperate reply flashed back, "Footing controlled." It was a calculated, necessary lie. A desperate attempt to avoid mass panic and maintain some semblance of order. Admitting the devastating truth might have plunged the entire convoy into chaos. On the flight deck, sailors gathered in quiet, anxious groups, watching the horizon glow faintly with the first, false promises of dawn. The mighty ship was no longer moving at full speed. Her massive engines strained valiantly, groaning under the immense, crushing weight of thousands of tons of invading water within her hull. In the control room of the Archerfish, the exhausted crew finally allowed themselves a collective, shaky breath. Enright ordered a course change to the east, away from their colossal target. "Keep her deep," he commanded. "We'll wait for daylight before surfacing." For the next several long hours, they heard only faint, muffled noises through the submarine's hull, distant, subdued explosions, the chilling sound of breaking metal, then, once again, the profound silence of the deep. "She's going down," someone whispered, the words hanging heavy in the air. Enright didn't answer directly. He simply nodded once, his face grim, and said, "Plot our position. We'll log it at dawn." By 5:00 a.m., Shinano's list had escalated to a critical 15 breeze. Water was now flooding through the lower decks faster than any pump, even those operating manually, could possibly handle. The ship's powerful generators failed one after another, plunging vast sections into darkness. Emergency lighting flickered weakly, casting the corridors in eerie, ghostly orange hues, deepening the sense of dread. Officers tried desperately to maintain order, but raw, primal panic was spreading like a virulent disease. Some men were ordered to abandon lower compartments that were already waist deep in freezing seawater. Others fought valiantly to keep vital machinery running, using flickering lanterns to navigate the suffocating darkness. Captain Abe stood resolute at the bridge windows, his gaze fixed on the brightening horizon. He could faintly discern Mount Fuji, a distant, ethereal silhouette against the dawn sky, a poignant symbol of home and a fading hope. "We can still make it," he told his first officer, a desperate plea in his voice. But even as he spoke, the ship began its inexorable slowing. The engines sputtered, coughed, then died. The Shinano had lost all power, completely, irrevocably. For the first time since the torpedoes had struck, Abe hesitated, a flicker of doubt in his steely resolve. The deck beneath him tilted again, a slow, unstoppable roll to starboard. 15 breakers became a terrifying 20 breaks. Seawater sloshed across the vast hangar deck, soaking precious machinery and ammunition crates. The escorting destroyers circled helplessly, like anxious, mournful dogs, unable to assist, too afraid to approach the massive, listing carrier for fear of being dragged down themselves. The order to abandon ship was still agonizingly withheld. Abe, a man bound by honor, stubbornly refused to relinquish his command. The Shinano had been built as a defiant proof of Japan's resilience, a symbol of its unbreakable spirit. Now, tragically, she was proving something else entirely, the devastating cost of believing that pride alone could ever replace meticulous preparation. By the time the sun fully rose, casting its indifferent rays upon the scene, the ocean around her was covered in a thin, iridescent sheen of oil. Men clung desperately to scattered debris, their hoarse cries for help swallowed by the vast, indifferent expanse of the sea. The ship's great hull tilted farther, its colossal bulk groaning and protesting as compartment after compartment collapsed under the crushing pressure. 70,000 tons of pride and desperate hope were slowly, agonizingly sinking into the depths, one flooded compartment at a time. Do you believe Captain Abe should have issued the evacuation order far earlier? Comment on, if you believe his unyielding pride tragically prevented him from saving more lives, or hit like, if you believe he felt he had no other honorable choice but to go down with his magnificent ship. By dawn, the Shinano was dying in a slow, agonizing ballad of destruction. The horizon had turned a muted, desolate gray, the sea deceptively calm, almost cruelly indifferent. From the air, she might still have appeared majestic, a colossal ship seemingly gliding serenely on the open water. But beneath the waterline, unseen by human eyes, utter chaos reigned supreme. 4 gaping torpedo wounds had ripped open her flank like savage knife cuts in flesh. And now, seawater poured relentlessly through every corridor, every vital shaft, every joint the builders in their haste hadn't meticulously sealed. Inside the suffocating boiler rooms, the water was already waist, deep and rising with terrifying speed. Steam hissed violently from broken valves, mixing sickeningly with the pungent stench of heavy oil and burnt insulation. Men fought with desperate, almost superhuman effort to keep the pumps running, but the crucial electrical panels had shorted out mere minutes after the initial hits. Now, they desperately turned the crank handles by hand, their muscles trembling with exhaustion, their faces blackened with soot and salt, their eyes wide with fear. One petty officer, his voice raw, screamed for a wrench. Another, his face grim, passed him a crowbar instead. Together they jammed it against a ruptured pipe, a futile attempt to slow the relentless flood. It didn't matter. For every gallon they painstakingly expelled, 10 more came rushing in, cold and unforgiving. On the cavernous hangar deck above, men were frantically hauling ammunition crates and spare parts to higher, as yet unfloated levels. Each heavy thud of footsteps echoed eerily through the vast hall, a sound of desperate, futile labor. The carrier's list had increased to a perilous 20 degrees. The entire starboard side of the deck tilted alarmingly toward the hungry sea. Equipment rolled uncontrollably across it, crashing with deafening force into bulkheads. A massive crate of aircraft engines broke loose, smashing a line of desperate sailors against the cold, unyielding wall, killing them instantly. The lights flickered one last, dying time, then utterly died, plunging the massive interior into a dim, ghostly half-light filtering from the open hangar hatches. In the communications room, the operators frantically tried to re-establish contact with the circling escorts. The radio flickered weakly, its precious batteries nearly drained. A single, desperate message managed to go out, floating uncontrolled. Request immediate assistance. But even that raw plea was barely transmitted. The carrier's antenna array had been severely damaged, and the faint signal dissolved into static before it could reach the destroyers. On the bridge, Captain Abe watched the sea through his binoculars, his face pale, drawn tight with the crushing weight of exhaustion. Around him, officers argued quietly, their voices strained. Some begged him, pleaded, to abandon ship. Others, still clinging to a sliver of hope, urged him to hold on, to fight. We can still tow her. One insisted, his voice cracking. If we can only reach shallow water. Shallow water is 50 miles away. Another interrupted, his voice edged with despair. We'll never make it. Abe said nothing. His gaze fixed on the horizon, his thoughts unreadable. His uniform was soaked, clinging to his body, his hands gripping the railing so tightly that his knuckles turned stark white. We will not abandon Shinano, he said finally, his voice hoarse but firm. Not while she still floats. Below decks, Lieutenant Nakamura, the engineering officer, a man of grim determination, was already bracing for the absolute worst. He had successfully sealed off 5 catastrophically flooded compartments, but the relentless water was now pushing against bulkheads that were never, in their hurried design, meant to withstand such immense, crushing pressure. The terrifying sound of the metal warping and tearing was unmistakable, a low, grinding moan like an animal in its death throes. She's twisting, Nakamura said quietly to his men, his voice barely above a whisper. The keel is under immense stress. They nodded grimly, but kept working, their bodies aching, hauling tools and makeshift plugs to slow the relentless leaks. One young sailor found a narrow compartment, where the very floor had already buckled under the strain. He frantically wedged a wooden board against a widening gap, then shouted to another man to bring mattresses. Together they jammed the mattresses into the space, their last, desperate hope of stemming the furious flow. For a few fleeting moments the leak seemed to slow. Then, with a sudden, violent burst, the mattress shot upward, propelled by the immense water pressure drenching both men. One slipped, fell into the freezing water, and vanished, swallowed by the darkness, before anyone could reach him. There was no time to look for him. By 700 a.m., the list had reached a critical 25 degrees. The destroyers had drawn closer now, circling like anxious, helpless dogs around their dying master. They could clearly see the great ship's starboard side submerging, her once proud flight deck slanting precariously toward the churning waves. They radioed repeatedly, their desperate queries unanswered, asking if assistance was required, but no reply came. Inside Shinano, the communication lines were utterly dead, the vast corridors echoing only with desperate shouts and the terrifying clang of twisting metal. In the ship's mess hall, a group of mechanics found themselves tragically trapped when a bulkhead door jammed shut. They pounded on it with wrenches and boots, screaming for help, their voices raw with panic. The sound carried faintly through the ventilation ducts, a ghost of a cry, but was quickly drowned out by the thunderous roar of water below. Some tried to climb through narrow maintenance hatches, but the angles were too steep, the ship's tilt too sharp, their desperate efforts futile. A young sailor named Shizuto, barely 19, somehow managed to force open a small hatch leading upward. He turned back, his heart pounding, trying to help another man through, but the deck shifted suddenly, violently beneath their feet. The dim light vanished. When the rescue team finally reached that section an hour later, they found only floating tools and oil. On the bridge, Captain Abe, his face a mask of profound grief, finally confronted the terrible truth. The ship's engines had irrevocably stopped. The list was now over 30 degrees, a terrifying tilt. The sun had risen high enough to glint off the waves, which were now lapping ominously at the lower hangar openings. "Order the destroyers to tow," Abe said quietly, his voice hollow. His officers relayed the desperate message by signal lamp. Ropes and thick cables were fired across the water, attached to the carrier's massive bow. For a few fleeting minutes, a flicker of desperate hope ignited. The destroyers strained at full power, their propellers churning the sea into a furious foam. The cables went taut, groaning under the immense, crushing load. Then, one by one, they snapped with terrifying force, steel recoiling with deadly speed, whipping through the air like lethal blades. One cable sliced through the carrier's railing. Another struck a sailor across the chest, killing him instantly. At 900 a.m., the ship was dead in the water, a colossal, dying hulk. The order to abandon ship still had not come. Men gathered on the dangerously slanted deck, staring out at the horizon, their faces numb, waiting for a command that never arrived. Some, driven by primal instinct, jumped on their own, desperately clinging to debris or life rafts. Others, tragically, refused to move, believing they would be court-martialed for disobedience if they abandoned their post. The rigid discipline that had built Japan's formidable navy now held its men captive as the relentless ocean rose to claim them. Inside the lower decks, compartments were collapsing one after another with terrifying finality. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of twisting steel, snapping rivets, and bulkheads imploding under the immense, crushing pressure. Air pockets burst like thunderclaps, sending waves of compressed air surging through corridors, hurling men violently against walls. The carrier's giant armor belt, paradoxically meant to protect her from torpedoes, now tragically trapped water inside her sinking hull, sealing her fate. At 10:00 a.m. Shinano rolled past 30 degrees, her demise now tragically inevitable. The order finally came, all hands abandon ship, but for many, it was agonizingly too late. The starboard rail was already completely underwater, and the port side rose like an insurmountable cliff above the churning sea. Men slid desperately across the violently tilted deck, grasping at cables, ladders, anything that might hold them against the powerful pull of gravity. Some jumped into the oily, freezing water below, disappearing beneath waves that boiled with debris and human desperation. On the bridge, Captain Abe, his face a mask of solemn resolve, steadfastly refused to leave. He removed his cap, smoothed his hair, and cast one last, long look toward the distant coastline, barely visible in the morning haze. "I will stay," he said quietly, his voice unwavering. His officers tried to protest, to pull him away, but he simply raised a hand, a gesture of finality. A captain's duty ends where his ship does. Moments later, the bridge tilted sharply, irrevocably. Water surged through the windows, cold and unforgiving. Captain Abe vanished into the churning sea with his command, a silent testament to a warrior's code. At 10:57 a.m., Shinano rolled completely onto her side, a dying leviathan. Her massive hull rose briefly above the waves, a final, defiant gasp, then slipped silently beneath the surface, stern first, leaving behind only a boiling, angry patch of foam and scattered, drifting wreckage. The largest warship ever constructed, a monument to a nation's pride, had lasted just 17 agonizing hours at sea. Of the 400 men aboard, barely 180 survived. The rest were tragically swallowed by the silent depths they had foolishly believed armor could defeat. Do you believe Captain Abe's refusal to surrender his command was an act of profound courage, or a tragic denial of reality? Comment on, if you think he died with honor, fulfilling a sacred duty, or hit like, if you believe his unwavering pride ultimately doomed hundreds who could have been saved. When the sea finally closed over Shinano, the cacophony of her death vanished almost instantly. The thunder of tearing metal, the desperate screams, the grinding of collapsing bulkheads, all were utterly consumed by the ocean's vast, cold indifference. For a few fleeting seconds, there was nothing but the eerie hiss of bubbles and the low, mournful moan of water filling empty spaces. Then, an absolute, profound silence. In that silence, hundreds of terrified men clung to the wreckage scattered across the surface. Oil spread in a slick, black sheen that glistened ominously beneath the pale morning sun. Debris, wooden planks, discarded life vests, shattered crates, mangled bits of machinery floated in every direction, a testament to the ship's violent demise. Survivors called out to each other, their voices raw and hoarse from seawater and smoke. "Over here! Help me!" Some shouted familiar names, others simply prayed, their desperate pleas lost to the wind. The destroyers circled cautiously, their crews staring in stunned disbelief. Moments earlier, they had been escorting the mightiest ship in the Imperial Navy. Now, she was gone, utterly erased from existence in less than a day. One of the destroyers, the Yukikais, bravely lowered ropes and nets, pulling men from the oil-stained, freezing sea. Many were barefoot, their uniforms torn, their faces coated in soot and salt. Some were silent, their eyes blank with shock and trauma. Others sobbed uncontrollably as they climbed aboard, leaving behind shipmates still drifting on the waves, their fates uncertain. The officers of the escort ship stood on deck, unable to bear looking at the water for long, the sight too devastating. One sailor later wrote, with chilling brevity, "The ocean smelled like metal and death. It didn't feel like we had lost a ship. It felt like we had lost something much larger, something of our very soul." By midday, the scattered survivors were distributed across the 3 destroyers. Captain Abe's body was never recovered. The sea had claimed him as surely and irrevocably as it had claimed his command. The men spoke little, their trauma too raw. When one young officer cautiously asked if they should radio Tokyo, his commander shook his head slowly, grimly. "Not yet. Not a word until we reach port." They knew, with a sickening certainty, the profound consequences of speaking too soon. News of such an unimaginable disaster could shatter morale across the entire, already beleaguered fleet. When the ships finally reached Kur Naval Base, they docked under the tightest guard, shrouded in secrecy. The survivors were immediately led ashore and taken to isolated barracks, their every movement scrutinized. Their clothes were burned, their names meticulously recorded. Then came the chilling order that sealed their silence, a decree that would echo for decades: "You will never speak of this ship, or of this day. The existence of Shinano is classified. Violators will face imprisonment." The men nodded numbly, too exhausted, too traumatized to argue. No one resisted. They had witnessed enough to understand that even survival could be dangerous in an empire built on a foundation of illusion and desperate hope. In Tokyo, the Admiralty gathered behind heavy, closed doors, their faces grim. The report from Kur was terrifyingly brief and utterly devastating. Shinano, the very pride of Japan, had sunk less than 24 hours after her fateful launch. The admiral who read the report is said to have placed it quietly on the table, his hand trembling, and whispered, his voice barely audible, "Then the sea has judged us." No official announcement was ever made. The newspapers remained conspicuously silent. To the Japanese public, Shinano simply never existed. Her name was meticulously erased from shipyard logs and fleet rosters, replaced by vague, innocuous references to a special project. Weeks later, American intelligence analysts at Pearl Harbor, poring over intercepted radio chatter from Japanese escorts, caught vague descriptions of rescue operations, but the details remained tantalizingly unclear. When Commander Joseph Enright, still unaware of the true identity of his quarry, filed his patrol report claiming he had sunk a large carrier, skeptical analysts doubted him. The Navy Board, unable to conceive of such a massive, unknown vessel, dismissed it as exaggeration, mere wishful thinking. No such carrier, they firmly believed, was known to exist in the Japanese fleet. Enright in his log wrote cautiously, "Target destroyed, possibly large tanker or auxiliary carrier, confirmed 4 detonations. Total loss probable." It wasn't until after Japan's unconditional surrender in 1945 that captured Japanese records, unearthed from secret archives, finally proved his extraordinary claim true. The Archerfish, a single unassuming submarine, had indeed sunk Shinano, the largest warship ever destroyed by a submarine in history. In the tumultuous post-war years, silence remained the ship's most enduring and haunting legacy. No photographs existed of Shinano at sea, a ghost ship even in her brief life. No official blueprints survived intact. Only a handful of fragmented testimonies, faded memories from the haunted men who had watched her die, would decades later begin to reveal the chilling truth of what had happened. A Japanese survivor, interviewed decades later, his voice quiet with the weight of memory, said hauntingly, "We believed armor could protect us from everything, but the ocean doesn't care about armor. It only cares about what is sealed, and what is not." Today, Shinano rests beneath 4,000 feet of crushing water off the coast of Honshu. The deep sea currents move slowly there, carrying fine sand and silt across her rusting hull. Her steel is corroded, her once mighty deck buried, her nameplate long gone, swallowed by the abyss. Yet, in the profound silence of that immense depth, she remains a somber monument to the dangerous illusion of invincibility. Steel, while formidable, can be forged in the fiercest fires, but pride, as Shinano tragically proved, is almost always forged in the crucible of fear. Do you believe Japan's greatest, most ambitious ship was ultimately doomed by its own inherent arrogance, or by the unstoppable, relentless power of change sweeping through the world? Comment on, if you think pride alone built her watery tomb, or hit like, if you believe her tragic death was an inevitable consequence in the new age of industrial warfare. When the devastating war finally ended, less than a year later, the name Shinano, once a whisper of desperate hope, reappeared not in triumph, but as a haunting ghost in the dusty official archives. American intelligence officers, meticulously combing through captured Japanese naval documents, stumbled upon her astonishing blueprints in a sealed file ominously labeled Project 798. What they discovered stunned even the hardened victors of the Pacific conflict. The Shinano had been an engineering marvel, far larger than the combined might of the Enterprise, the Hornet, and even the famed Yorktown. She had been launched in utmost secrecy, guarded by thousands of devoted men, a colossal undertaking born of desperation. And yet, she had never completed a single combat mission, never unleashed her intended aerial power. The world's largest aircraft carrier, a symbol of unyielding national will, had been defeated not by the thunder of bombs or the fury of naval guns, but by the cold, unforgiving mathematics of water pressure, the profound failures of human engineering, and the blinding arrogance of hubris. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the stark truth was almost unbearable. a devastating blow to their very psyche. The catastrophic loss of Shinano symbolized the complete collapse of everything the empire had fervently believed about itself, its capabilities, its destiny. For years, Japan had meticulously built its formidable power on the powerful, dangerous idea that unparalleled craftsmanship and indomitable courage could somehow overcome the crushing weight of industrial inferiority. The Shinano was meant to prove, with undeniable, steel-clad certainty, that unwavering faith could forge an impregnable fortress of steel, a vessel so mighty that no amount of relentless American production could ever hope to match it. Instead, she tragically proved the exact opposite, that no amount of armor, however thick, could ever compensate for a crumbling system, for compromised design, for a nation on the brink of collapse. When the survivors were finally allowed to speak, many years after the war had ended, they described not a sudden, cataclysmic explosion, but a slow, agonizing unraveling. It wasn't the torpedoes that ultimately sank her. One former engineer said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of memory. It was the decisions made long before she ever touched the water. He spoke of the compromises forced by desperation, the frantic rush to launch her before completion, the stubborn refusal to test crucial systems, the dangerous arrogance of commanders who blindly believed that sheer size alone equated to absolute safety. In that profound sense, Shinano's sinking was not merely an unfortunate accident of war. It was the devastating, inevitable result of an empire built on a foundation of dangerous illusion. In Washington, naval analysts studied the incident with morbid fascination. How could such a massive, seemingly invincible vessel sink so quickly, so completely? The answer, they realized, lay in a brutal, undeniable equation: strength without integrity is weakness multiplied exponentially. Shinano's unfinished compartments, a testament to her rushed construction, created perfect, uncontrolled channels for catastrophic flooding. Her vital, untested pumps failed instantly, rendered useless. Her armor, while thick and impressive, became a cruel, impenetrable trap that sealed water inside, ensuring her rapid demise. Every single decision, ironically meant to protect her, ended up ensuring her swift, violent destruction. But beyond the engineering flaws, there was a deeper, more profound meaning that both sides, eventually, came to understand. Shinano marked the unequivocal end of an era, the age of the colossal super ship. The Yamato-class battleships, once hailed as unyielding symbols of invincible firepower, were already tragically obsolete by 1944. The future clearly belonged to mobility, to pinpoint precision, to rapid adaptability. It belonged to submarines that moved unseen beneath the surface, to aircraft that struck with devastating accuracy from miles away, to radar systems that could track enemies far beyond the horizon. Shinano was the very last of the giants, a titan built for a bygone age, and the unforgiving ocean proved, with brutal finality, that there was no place left for such giants. In the tumultuous post-war years, Japan would rebuild itself with astounding resilience, not with the heavy, vulnerable armor of steel, but with the boundless power of innovation. The very same engineers who had once welded colossal steel plates for carriers now meticulously designed groundbreaking civilian ships, efficient trains, and pioneering aircraft, all imbued with an almost obsessive dedication to precision and safety. The nation that had once desperately chased the elusive dream of invincibility learned, through bitter experience, to master the art of efficiency. The haunting lesson of Shinano lingered quietly behind that profound transformation, that perfection, when devoid of true humility, is merely a blueprint for catastrophic collapse. For the Americans who had successfully hunted her, Shinano became a powerful symbol of redemption. Commander Joseph Enright, once unfairly criticized for caution, received the Distinguished Navy Cross for his audacious attack. His submarine, Archerfish, was awarded a prestigious Presidential Unit Citation, the highest honor for a crew in wartime service. Yet, when asked about his remarkable victory years later, Enright did not boast or gloat. "We didn't even know her name," he said in a quiet interview, his voice still tinged with disbelief. "She was just a shadow on the water. We fired because we had to. We learned afterwards what she was. It still feels unreal. It was more than just a victory, it was a profound revelation." The Archerfish proved, with chilling clarity, that in the brutal industrial warfare of the 20th century, intelligence, unwavering patience, and precise calculation could utterly destroy what brute force alone could not. No fleet, no nation, could ever again rely on sheer weight or impenetrable armor alone. The battlefield had become invisible, fought with complex codes, subtle sound waves, and machines that could think and react faster than men. In Japan, the haunting memory of Shinano remained forbidden, a hushed secret for decades. The shipyard workers who had built her rarely spoke of it, except in soft, fearful whispers. One welder, interviewed in the 1960s, summed up the entire tragedy in a single, poignant line. "We were told to build her strong. We were never told to build her ready." That powerful sentence became the quiet, unspoken epitaph of the Shinano, etched not on stone, but into the very fabric of history. Today, the ship's wreck lies silently buried under 4,000 feet of profound, cold silence. Its steel corroded, its story complete, its mysteries guarded by the deep. Divers have never reached her. The ocean guards her secrets with the same unwavering indifference it showed that fateful night in 1944. Yet, her legacy remains undeniably visible above the waves, a poignant lesson echoed in every modern design that values adaptability over arrogance, in every military doctrine that measures true readiness not in sheer size, but in meticulous precision. The Shinano was meant to restore a nation's shattered pride. Instead, she became a brutal lesson, written in cold salt water. That pride, when armored too heavily, inevitably transforms into its own fatal weakness. She was built in oppressive darkness, launched in desperate haste, and lost to an enduring silence. But her profound story endures, not as a monument to fleeting strength, but as an eternal testament to the painful, vital understanding gained through tragedy. Do you believe the age of truly invincible machines ended irrevocably with Shinano's tragic loss? Comment on if you think her sinking marked the definitive turning point of modern naval warfare, or hit like if you believe humanity will always, perhaps foolishly, continue to try and build something unsinkable, no matter how many times the ocean, in its eternal wisdom, proves us tragically wrong.